much lower case fatality rate. And although it tended to spread more easily, it was a flu, it was an influenza pandemic, it had a very much lower case fatality rate. Doesn't really matter whether it's a case fatality rate or an infection fatality rate. If you became infected with it, there was a very, very, very much greater chance that you would survive.
Correct.
So the disease to avoid is a disease that is both transmissible and severe.
Yes. Indeed.
And that, of course, is a disease that must be prepared for. Yeah. My lady, I hope that answers the question that you posed.
Thank you.
Turning back to your report, please, INQ 000196611. And page 7. You describe in your report how there are coronaviruses, and we've heard something about the 3 major coronaviruses which have been of the greatest concern. And you discuss influenza. But you refer in paragraph 8 to something called disease X, which you describe as a hypothetical future disease with the potential to cause a global pandemic. Now, disease X isn't a real disease. As you say, it's a hypothetical scenario. What is the benefit in terms of prevention or countermeasures or preparedness of identifying a hypothetical disease, which is called disease X? What benefit does that give us?
So basically the idea behind disease X is that it is not unreasonable that we will encounter a large outbreak, maybe a pandemic, from a disease that we did not previously know the properties of. Obviously, preparing for something that we do not know the properties of, if we don't have a concept of that, is very difficult. And therefore, we have disease X as this hypothetical disease that we don't know the properties of, just like we might not know the properties of a future pandemic disease. And in a way, then, disease X is supposed to teach us how to prepare for unexpected things and how not to fall into the trap of preparing for something that we already know and that has happened in the past.
So putting it another way, is it a method perhaps of focusing the mind more sharply on a potential future but very real risk?
You could say that.
Has there always been a proper understanding of disease X, or has this approach of trying to identify or focus on a hypothetical disease been a more recent development?
So the idea of preparedness inherently has an understanding of something unexpected potentially happening. Now, if you want to put it like that, operationalizing that into disease X has happened within the last decade and a half.
And by that, do you mean scientific bodies, both the United Kingdom and abroad, and the World Health Organization in particular, has focused or started to focus much more on what disease X might be, and therefore to try to sharpen its focus on how best to take steps to prevent against what that disease may turn out to be? Professor Whitworth, you mentioned the Prioritization Committee for the World Health Organization and your membership of the committee. In a sense, was that committee, by prioritizing attention on particular diseases, including coronavirus diseases, trying to identify what that disease X might be and therefore trying to guard against that possibility?
Yes, that would be true. If we think about coronaviruses, we know there are many thousands of those. We had experience of 2 coronaviruses, SARS and MERS, getting into the human population during the 21st century, and it was a reasonable bet that another one might come into the human population, which we've seen with COVID here. And it's also very plausible that another one might come along in the future.
If you don't know whether or not disease X is going to be a coronavirus or virus or zoonotic or whatever it might be, whatever it might turn out to be, what is the practical benefit to us all of focusing on disease X? Obviously, the precise means of protecting ourselves against the disease depends to a very large extent on what that disease turns out to consist of.
I think twofold. I think one, it encourages us to be flexible in our approach and not to very slavishly think about what we did for the last epidemic or the last series of epidemics like the ones you've shown on your chart. But also it allows us to develop a sort of generic framework of how we would deal with a disease that was spread, say, by the respiratory route, was of a certain level of transmissibility, certain level of severity, and think about what measures we would need to put in place to be able to control such a disease.
Professor, the United Kingdom, like many countries, on the onset of COVID-19, focused its attentions on a influenza pandemic, but was struck, of course, by coronavirus. So from the viewpoint of December 2019, that coronavirus, COVID-19, was the disease X. It was the disease which struck us. Was there a failure, do you think, by many countries around the world to identify that possibility, therefore that they did over-slavishly focus on influenza and not what the other disease might turn out to be?
I think that's a fair criticism, but I think we have to remember that when this first struck, we knew very little about the biological properties of this disease. And so at that stage, while we were scrambling to get more information, it would be best to start with a plan of something that was relatively similar, but to keep in mind that we need to be flexible to change that as the evidence emerged.
Quite so, but much of what you said, of course, is concerned with being able to respond and to be flexible sufficiently to be able to respond. But in terms of not seeing, not appreciating perhaps the nature of the disease which ultimately struck us, do you believe that there was too great a focus, not exclusively a focus, but too great a focus on a different type of disease? We prepared in the main for a influenza pandemic, and that wasn't the pandemic that struck.
Yes, I think that's a fair criticism. With the two coronavirus epidemics that had occurred previously, there was quite a divergence in the epidemiological features of that, the transmissibility and the severity and the amount of symptomatic versus non-symptomatic cases that were there, which means that it would be hard to predict exactly what would happen with a new coronavirus that we hadn't experienced before.
You've explained to us what transmissibility is. Can I ask you, please, to say a little more about what asymptomatic and symptomatic
Certainly,
viral infection means?
If one thinks about people who are infected with a virus, they might show symptoms and have disease, or they might not. And if they don't, but they're simply infected but otherwise well, they are asymptomatic.
So flu, influenza in the main, is symptomatic, is it not? You know that you've got flu, and you therefore know that you might have to take a step to isolate yourself and go home or go to bed and stop it being passed on.
Mostly, but as we've discussed, there was a swine flu epidemic where we had very large numbers of cases, and there were many people who didn't know that they were infected.
So, in fact, even if you were to focus on an influenza pandemic to the exclusion of all other pandemics, you would necessarily have to prepare for both asymptomatic and symptomatic versions of that pandemic.
Indeed, yes.
But bringing you back to the debate about disease X, if in the scientific community for some time now there was an appreciation of the importance of focusing on the hypothetical disease X to make sure that you weren't blindsided by an unexpected virus or pathogen, a disease, why then was that perhaps excessive focus on influenza pandemics as opposed to coronaviral or some other form?
I think because that is where we had the most experience before in dealing with influenza epidemics that occurred previously, and to use that as a starting point of how you would approach a coronavirus epidemic was reasonable while we gathered further information.
And into that mixture, what about the fact that there had been in very recent history 2 coronaviral pandemics?
That's true. That really ought to be factored in as well. But remember that those 2 were quite divergent in their effects on the human population. So it wasn't as if you could say, this is a coronavirus, this is the plan we need to follow.
Thank you. Well, that's very clear. Then may we turn, please, to the second of your major categories of risk, antimicrobial resistance, which you address in detail at paragraph 16 of your report. I want to ask you, please, about the risk posed by antimicrobial resistance. You refer there to the fact that antimicrobial resistance has 2 features to it. There is firstly the issue of transmissibility, that is to say, if you have a disease, a pathogen that can't be controlled by, for example, antibiotics, then there is the concern that the particular disease or pathogen could spread easily, transmissibility, and also that there is the further issue of transmissibility of resistance genes between pathogens. What does that second reference mean, the issue of transmissibility of resistance genes between pathogens?
So this is a specific feature, particular of bacteria that develop resistance, and between themselves, by the way of how a bacterium works biologically, there is a possibility of the ability to detect and counter an antibiotic can be shared between bacteria.
And therefore that has an impact upon the line or the degree of resistance, as well as on the future development of the pathogen or the disease.
And of the spread of resistance in general.
So it's a cascading effect.
Indeed.
All right. The third broad area of biosecurity, I'm sorry, I should have asked you, in paragraph 16, you refer to the fact that AMR, antimicrobial resistance, has gained the label Silent Pandemic, and that in 2016 it was predicted to kill about 10 million people per year by 2050. You make the point that the precise future course of antimicrobial resistance is uncertain, but is the point that you make in the paragraph that potentially there could be catastrophic consequences from AMR as well?
Yes.
Has that risk changed over the last few years, at least since the prediction of 10 million people by 2050 was made in 2016?
I think it has changed in both directions, so it is probably very difficult to quantify that change. But we have both an increased awareness, and resulting from that increased awareness, increase what we call antimicrobial stewardship, so trying to slow down the spread of resistance. But on the other hand, we also still have significant use of antimicrobials that speed up the level of resistance. So I would not want to speculate what that would mean for that estimated number.
All right. The third broad area of biosecurity threat that you identify is what you call human origin risks, and you deal with that at page 11, commences at page 10, page 10, paragraph 18. And you describe how there is a non-zero risk of a pandemic originating from either deliberate or accidental human behaviour. Have there in the recent past been any significant incidents of human origin leak? That's to say, by way of, malicious use of a pathogen or a disease or an accident in a laboratory?
So if we look at accidents first, these have happened in the past. So we are aware of 4 incidents involving the first SARS-CoV-1, for example. The 2007 foot and mouth disease outbreak in the UK, which some of you might still remember, that was a laboratory leak. That was an accidental release. And then the largest one that we are aware of was in 2019, and that was a Brucella outbreak in China, again associated with a laboratory accident.
All right. Now, whether or not a disease infects the human race by virtue of a laboratory accident or malicious use, deliberate infection, biowarfare, does that matter in terms of properly preparing ourselves? Does it matter whether the infection of humans starts from a zoonotic spillover or an accident or malicious use? The fact is that the transmission has started and must be then addressed.
That is absolutely true. And the further along you go, the less it matters. At the point where we have a pandemic, it probably does not matter at all anymore where the very first case came from, at least in terms of addressing that particular pandemic. It does obviously matter in terms of prevention, trying to stop these outbreaks from happening at all. But in terms of the preparedness and response for if it happens, it actually matters very little. Now, obviously, if we talk about things like altered pathogens, there might be slight changes, but then again, that would probably fall under disease X again.
All right. So whereas doctrinally there may be some purpose to be gained in identifying one of these 3 broad biosecurity threats as being human origin behaviour, a leak or deliberate use, in terms of focusing on what we can do to protect ourselves and countermeasures and so on, that broad area of risk is of less significance.
Well, I think the importance of knowing where something came from is predominantly in finding out if this is an avenue that we can shut down for the future. So is this, for example, on the naturally occurring side, is this a common interaction between humans and animals which can be made safer? On the laboratory side, is this something that we have overlooked in our procedures? And then obviously when we talk about malicious use, there are other forensic and security implications.
All right. Now, a government in any country, when faced with the outbreak of a disease or a pathogen, however it commences, is faced with a number of conundrums, is it not? That there are all number of considerations which have to be taken into account when deciding how to react. And taken into account when deciding how to react. And you set some out at paragraph 22 on page 11 of your report. And I'd just to run very briefly through the considerations which you've set out there, because they all have an impact on how any government will respond. And of course, but therefore one has to have an eye to them when formulating recommendations or how better to respond in the future. So the first bullet point, a small cluster of infections has variable potential to become widely established in the population, and this is challenging to predict accurately in advance. Is that a way of saying that when any outbreak starts, you just don't know whether it's going to become an epidemic or a pandemic or how wide it'll go? You don't know whether it's going to go in that direction or that direction, whether it's a problem or whether it can be ignored. How, therefore, do governments prepare, in a general sense, against outbreak of disease when, putting aside the inability to be able to prepare for every single risk and every single disease, when they're alerted to an outbreak somewhere in the world, how do they know whether or not it requires them to press the
to a case or a cluster of cases? And it will also require a different capacity, because obviously when we're talking about early response here, we're not talking about the response as we've seen over the past couple of years. We're talking about a small local team investigating.
To find out what has happened, and if there is a pathogen on the loose, to take steps locally to make sure that it doesn't become a crisis.
Indeed, and in fact, one of the very first things we do in an outbreak investigation is to verify there actually is an outbreak.
That, or any sense of any system of global surveillance and local response to prevent, I don't know, a drama becoming a crisis, requires, therefore, visibility or transparency around the world, because we all have to know, therefore, what's going on in some other part of the world where outbreaks are occurring. Is that what you mean when you refer in the next paragraph to the spirit of One Health? So, ensuring that, in general terms, response systems are interdisciplinary, they are well-funded, that they're global, that they take account holistically of the whole system, so that we're not blindsided by something we didn't see coming.
One Health is a bit more specific than that. So One Health is specifically collaborative, multi-sectoral, transdisciplinary approaches across humans, animals, and the environment. So it is the working together of these three sectors particularly.
Why is a spirit or an approach of One Health of practical assistance to us?
Now, if we look at sort of two of the three biosecurity threats that we've outlined, zoonotic diseases and antimicrobial resistance, both of those happen at the intersection between humans, animals, and the environment. And, for example, if you think about a zoonotic disease, it is not unreasonable to think that you might see something in the animals first. But if the animal health sector and the human health sector do not talk to each other, this becomes very difficult. Whereas if these are integrated systems, if they speak the same language, if they feed into a common system, is much more possible to have those early alerts, even potentially before we see first human cases.
And if I may just add to that, if you took a view of human health in a population and you focused it just on what's happening in hospitals, just what's happening in GP surgeries, you'd get a very biased picture because you wouldn't see that much wider picture of the interaction in the environment and with other animals.
So in essence, it is about trying to understand more broadly but more clearly what's going on out there and ensuring an early opportunity to intervene to stop a bad position becoming a great deal worse.
Yes.
Indeed.
You describe, in the context of surveillance, a number of different methods of surveillance and alert systems. You describe something called syndromic surveillance and horizon scanning, epidemic surveillance. Are there a number of international and alert systems, and are there a number of different ways of carrying out surveillance?
Yes, on both counts.
Now, in relation to COVID-19, the United Kingdom and the world were informed, I think, round about the same time. They became informed from doctors in China. They became informed from an entry on the surveillance system ProMed, and the WHO China office also issued an alert. This was all at the end of December 2019. Provided there is at least one working, comprehensive, effective surveillance system or alert system, is there a need for more surveillance systems or multiple surveillance systems? And if there is an international surveillance system, does the United Kingdom have to have its own surveillance system? Ultimately, the United Kingdom was, with the rest of the world, informed at the end of December 2019 that there was an outbreak.
So taking sort of the national and international, a lot of information from national surveillance systems feed into international surveillance. International surveillance, at least if we're talking about traditional surveillance, so not looking at media alerts, for example, cannot stand on its own because it requires lab capacity in every country. It requires clinicians notifying in every country. So you can't really take the two apart and say we only need one or we only need the other.
All right. Was there an independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response convened in 2001? Are you aware of that panel? It's not something I confess that you've addressed in your report, but it relates to some of the matters that you've covered. If you haven't got it to hand, then,
so that is the report from the independent panel that you are referring to. For pandemic
preparedness and response.
Indeed.
Is that something that you're able to discuss? I don't know, Doctor, whether or not you happen to have a copy there.
Yes, we do.
We've got in our system. Could we have 183545, please?
Do you have it? It's number 3 in the witness.
And page, there it is, the independent panel, it says in the bottom right, bottom left-hand corner for pandemic preparedness and response in very small letters. COVID-19, make it the last pandemic. Could we just go forward slowly, a couple of pages at a time, and we'll get our bearings? So there are the contents. Recommendations were made by the panel after a review of the devastating reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you please go to page 15 of what I hope are 86 pages? So one of the first points that the panel made was that before the pandemic, there was a general failure to take preparation seriously. And it says this: in under 3 months from when SARS-CoV-2 was first identified as the cause of clusters of unusual pneumonia cases in Wuhan, COVID-19 had become a global pandemic threatening every country. Although public health officials, infectious disease experts, and previous international commissions and reviews had warned of potential pandemics, COVID-19 still took large parts of the world by surprise. It should not have done. The number of infectious disease outbreaks has been accelerating, many of which have pandemic potential. And then it's clear to the panel that the world was not prepared and had ignored warnings. And the panel refer to the SARS epidemic about which you've spoken in 2003, and then further later down the page, but we needn't go to it, to MERS and Ebola, as well as Zika. Now, that view, which you may or may not share, would tend to suggest that the prior existence or the prior occurrence of SARS-CoV-1 and MERS should have put the world generally into a greater state of preparedness. That in that very difficult debate to which you refer about being ready for the right disease but not crying wolf, not being over-prepared for something that doesn't come and being properly prepared for something that does come, the balance may have been out, that there should have been just a higher degree of awareness of a coronavirus and of the possibility that the next pandemic would be a coronavirus. Would you agree with that general proposition?
I think that by the middle of January of 2020, people in the international public health community were aware that this was out of the ordinary, this outbreak. This wasn't just a small cluster that was going to die away. This looked like it was something bigger than that. And I think by the end of January, people in public health, certainly in the UK, were very clear that this was an impending wave that was coming to the UK. And those of us who had memory of SARS, the parallels with that were something that gave us shivers.
And SARS, of course, was something that had affected other countries as well, or primarily not the United Kingdom, but countries in the Far East.
Yes.
And that gives rise, doesn't it, to the debate about their preparedness, because they had been through SARS in a way which we had not.
Yes.
Could we look, please, at page 25? The panel, in the different context of discussing an approach to responding to pandemics by applying what's known as the precautionary principle, that is to say, assuming when you first become aware of an outbreak that it will have human-to-human transmission and therefore be more transmissible, said this at the bottom of the page: while the World Health Organization was rapid and assiduous in its early dissemination of the outbreak alert to countries around the world, its approach in presenting the nature and level of risk was based on its established principles guided by the international health regulations. While the WHO advised on the possibility of human-to-human transmission in the period until it was confirmed and recommended measures that health workers should take to prevent infection, the panel's view is that it could also have told countries that they should take the precaution of assuming that human-to-human transmission was occurring. So what the panel appeared to be saying is, when you have an outbreak, assume the worst, assume it will be human-to-human transmission, and therefore prepare for that worst, assuming, of course, that the outbreak has got past a certain stage and therefore requires a response at all. What do you say about the notion or the argument that there should be a precautionary principle applied, so that you should assume that the next significant outbreak will be human-to-human, or will have significant human-to-human transmission? Is that a sensible way to proceed in your view?
I think there's a fine balance. As I hope we've got across, there are very many clusters of cases which might or might not be an outbreak that we're aware of on a daily basis. To take the precautionary viewpoint that each one of those could turn into a pandemic would be a huge waste of effort and resources. To have good surveillance so we can see how this is developing, and we can sift and we can identify those that we are worried about till they reach a certain stage, I think is a sensible approach. Once they reach a stage that, yes, this is something we are worried about, then absolutely, I think a precautionary approach then becomes required. But that will be for a very small minority of all the outbreaks that we are aware of. So it's quite a tricky judgment call about which ones you want to focus your efforts upon. And certainly speaking to senior members of UK public health community in late January, they were of the view that they ought to overreact rather than underreact to this.
And the key word then, if I may say so, Professor, in your answer is then, because you said you can't treat every outbreak as serious. You've got to wait to see how it develops. You need surveillance to see the outbreaks occurring, and then you can assess and sift. Yeah. But then there would be something to be said for applying a precautionary principle.
Agreed.
So in the case of Covid-19, in your report, you identified that the World Health Organization identified what's known as a PHEIC on the 30th of January 2020, a public health emergency of international concern. So the outbreak had clearly required that level of reaction from the WHO. It hadn't yet been declared a pandemic. It wasn't declared a pandemic until March. Is there, however, something to be said, or would something have been said for applying a precautionary principle at that stage when the world began to realize there was an outbreak serious enough to call it a public health emergency of international concern, and say, well, let's assume from then on it will be likely to have, or must be approached on the basis it does have sustained human-to-human transmission. That's the precautionary principle in action.
I think in this case, in hindsight, yes. I would agree with that. But again, if you declare a public health emergency of international concern, or WHO, then that has huge logistic and resource implications for the world of having declared that that's the case. And if you declare too many of those at any one time, then you're going to divert resources, manpower, time from the ones that are most important. So again, it's a bit of a judgment call.
And can you say what the proportion is of outbreaks, pathogenic outbreaks, disease outbreaks, that are declared a public health emergency of international concern by the WHO? So if the concern is, and it's readily understandable, you can't presume human-to-human transmission for every outbreak. You should only do so in relation to those that are serious or significant or which have the real capacity to cause damage. There aren't that many diseases that are declared a PHEIC, are there?
Very small number.
That's very true. It is a very small number. And one of the critiques of that system is that it's, if you like, almost an all or nothing declaration. It either is a public health emergency of international concern or it isn't. And to have a more
nuanced,
graded system for being able to respond would be beneficial.
Right.
And maybe also of note here, for something to be a public health emergency of international concern, it has to be of international concern. That does not mean it has to affect the entire world. So an Ebola outbreak, very unlikely to affect the entire world, but can very well be a public health emergency of international concern.
Now, whilst we're looking at PHEICs and the WHO Health Organization, is there a legal structure called the International Health Regulations, which 2005, which underpins the WHO's approach to outbreaks of concern?
There is.
Yes.
Just for historical interest, primarily, is there a process of assurance or testing or grading of an individual country's response under the auspices of the WHO and the international health regulations?
There is.
And is that what's known as the joint external evaluations?
Yes.
And as a matter of interest, how did the United Kingdom fare in those international-based but locally assessed assessment procedures, the joint external evaluations, before the COVID pandemic?
The UK has never undergone, to our knowledge, a formal joint external evaluation. It has participated in the pilot scheme for this and scored highly, and it has participated in self-scoring following the same metrics as a joint external evaluation, which again it has done fairly well.
And did it also, was it also subject to some procedure, some testing process under the, what's known as the Global Health Security Index?
Yes, that was also done, I believe, by Harvard and adopted by WHO.
And again, it did relatively well in that assessment as well.
It did.
Do you happen to know how well the United Kingdom has fared in any self-assessed, voluntary or compulsory evaluations since COVID-19?
I'm not aware of any since.
Not after. So the latest self-assessment of IHR indicators was in 2021.
Yes.
And in that, the UK did fairly well with a 93% score. So that's 93% across 15 IHR capacity scores.
Can we then turn, please, to page 13 of your report, paragraph 27, where you deal with the issue of response capacity with scale-up capacity. And you make the point, which may to some degree be self-evident, that it's critical that there is sufficient capacity to respond to any alert generated by one or more surveillance systems. In the body of the paragraph, you refer to a metric or a standard, a target of a certain number of epidemiologists per 100,000 of the population as being a standard or a metric proposed for scientific response capacity. Could you just explain to us, please, how in the context of the response to COVID-19, having more or less or the same amount of epidemiologists might have made a difference in those days of the end of December 2019 and the beginning of January 2020?
Certainly. So what we're talking here about are what we call field epidemiologists. So that's applied epidemiologists, that's people who run surveillance. So there is the obvious link there to actually seeing things early enough. And they are also the people who act upon alerts, who do the local outbreak investigation. So those local teams I referred to a moment ago, these would be primarily staffed by field epidemiologists. So having those being able to address things in early stages makes a significant difference. But also, obviously, these people then go through the ranks. They will form the body of a lot of intervention strategies in terms of the epidemiological side. So that will be being able to run contact tracing and to oversee that, being able to run dedicated new surveillance systems, even being able to come up with a dedicated new surveillance system, which is not a trivial task.
And so in the context of the United Kingdom, and I appreciate this is a huge area, Can you say anything about whether or not, as a country, we were sufficiently blessed with the right number of epidemiologists and scientists and so on to create both the research base that is required in responding to any outbreak or pandemic, and also to create the response mechanisms, diagnostic testing, vaccines, clinical care, and so on and so forth?
So, few things to take apart there,
Yes.
I'm afraid. So, from the field epidemiology side, which only covers a few of those things, primarily surveillance and response to outbreaks, the international standard is 1 trained field epidemiologist per 200,000. This is a scaled-down version of the US target of 1 per 100,000, and that is primarily to make it achievable for lower middle-income countries. This is sort of the minimum standard. It is very difficult to measure how many field epidemiologists there are. There are some proxy measures that aren't particularly perfect either. I have very little doubt that we are above that threshold in the UK, and that we have a fair number of field epidemiologists. Other things that you mentioned, though, things like clinical capacity, things like developing testing, they require a slightly different skill set. Again, from my understanding, the UK has fairly large capacity.
You address in paragraph 29 on page 14 the general and obvious good sense principle of having sufficient microbiologists, social scientists, clinicians, animal health experts, and so on and so forth. Again, relatively self-evident, one might think. Can you express a view as to whether or not, generally across that broad range of professions, again, we were well blessed in terms of the scientific resource and the clinical and the microbiological and the environmental expertise necessary to deal with a pandemic?
I'd say that generally, yes, we were, but I think the point about coordinated multidisciplinary approaches we were not necessarily so good at. I think we had these various groups and these various pools, but they were not necessarily interconnected.
Too much working in silos or the like?
Indeed.
All right. Well, Milady, that's an issue which I'm setting the building blocks for, which we'll be looking at in much greater detail later. Could you now go forward, please, to page 17?
Just before you do, Mr. Keith, could I just go? It's going back a bit, and I just wanted to check firstly with you, Professor Whitworth, that I've accurately noted what you said, and then check whether you, Dr. Hammer, agree. And what I've noted, Professor, is that you said it was reasonable to use the plans for a flu pandemic as a starting point until we gathered more data. Is that an accurate record of what you said?
Yes, my lady.
And Dr. Hammer, do you agree?
So, first of all, any plan for a respiratory outbreak will be better than none. A dedicated plan is better than one for something else. But I think Professor Whitworth has quite nicely laid out that there were certain difficulties with this with regard to coronaviruses, particularly the divergence between MERS and SARS. So from that point of view, I certainly do agree.
Thank you very much.
So page 17, please. Thank you very much. In this part of your report, you list a number of pathogens or diseases which have been prioritized by the World Health Organization for research and development. And you, if you scroll down over to the page, the next page, please, you list high consequence infectious diseases which are on the list kept by a committee called the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens. That's paragraph 37. You also list those pathogens or diseases in relation to which the United Kingdom Vaccines Network invests in vaccine development as a priority. And then you actually go on to deal with other lists of pathogens kept by other international bodies and by overseas bodies, for example, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the United States of America. Is the point about your lists and the fact that these various bodies list these particular diseases as priorities, that the danger of listing diseases as a priority is that you may not see the one that comes from the left field? And or is it the point that in the United Kingdom, in advance of COVID, whilst we had a system in place that was thought to be flexible, that coped with the possibility of a generic pandemic, we didn't as a country proceed by way of trying to identify every possible significant risk and then planning for it?
I think these lists of diseases are set up for different purposes by different bodies. So with WHO, this is looking specifically to identify what are the priority diseases for which the world needs vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutic drugs, and therefore will put out a call for work to be done to develop vaccines or whatever for a specific disease, to actually focus academia, industry, so on, in developing vaccines for those kind of conditions. The same sort of thing with the UK Vaccines Network, that had funding to start to develop vaccines for this specific list.
Right.
For a country to be thinking about what the risks are and how one deals with those, it may be less useful to have a specific list of pathogens. It might be better to, as the UK does, to say pandemic influenza and new and emerging infections that are coming up. But the follow-through for that is that one ought to have a plan that is a framework for how you would deal with a respiratory disease or a gastrointestinal disease or so on. And if that's the case, that's fine not to have a list as such, but you've got a framework for how you would deal with categories of disease.
So just to summarise the position, I hope I do so correctly, Professor, the approach taken by the United Kingdom, which was and is a sensible one, is not to operate on the basis of a prescriptive list of priority diseases, identifying each disease one by one and saying, this is how we'll prepare for that disease, this is how we'll prepare for this one. You make plain that in the various documents and the procedures and the processes applied by the United Kingdom, there was a general preparation for a pandemic, influenza pandemic, but also a different style of preparation, although there were overlaps, for what was called a new and emerging infectious disease, the precise nature of which wouldn't be known. So that general approach, whereby you try to have a broad framework which you then apply to the eventuality, that you apply to the specifics of the disease that actually does occur, is a sensible one.
Yes, I think it is sensible. It allows one to be flexible in one's approach. So, for example, the list that we've produced for the high consequence infectious diseases that the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens considers, we've got a list there that we ought to have plans for, but that ought to be a flexible list, and there ought to be generic plans for how one would deal with contact transmission, how one would deal with respiratory transmission.
So in fact, what you're suggesting is that there should be specific plans for specific pathogens on that list, but at the same time, alongside those plans, a general framework to deal with the unexpected outcome, the disease or the pathogen that takes us by surprise.
Yes, indeed.
Right. All right. You then deal with expert advisory groups in the United Kingdom at page 20, and you describe them for us, the New and Emerging Respiratory Viral Threats Advisory Group, NERVTAG, about which, milady, we will hear a very great deal more in Module 2. The Human Animal Infections and Risk Surveillance Group, HARES, the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens, to which you've just mentioned, ACDP, which you just mentioned, and also the National Expert Panel on New and Emerging Infections. Might it be thought that we have rather quite a few committees and groups in the United Kingdom dealing with various aspects of zoonotic diseases, respiratory infections, dangerous pathogens, new and emerging infections, and the like? Is there an argument for some rationalisation of those bodies?
I think it is useful as expert groups to have them focused on the areas where their expertise lies. And I think they do have robust discussions and divergent opinions, so I think it's useful for them to have that body of expertise to do that. I think what is really important, though, is that the recommendations that come from those bodies are coordinated and synthesised within government to get an overarching view of the risks.
And is that because, by their very nature, by their description, by their scope, each of these bodies focuses in a slightly different area? So NERVTAG only considers respiratory viruses because it is the New and Emerging Respiratory Viral Threats Advisory Group.
Exactly.
The Human Animal Infections and Risk Surveillance Group considers only zoonotic diseases.
Yes.
The Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens doesn't include global surveillance or horizon scanning. And the last body I mentioned, the National Expert Panel on New and Emerging Infectious Diseases, which I'm sure did exactly how it described itself on the tin, has in fact been disbanded.
Yes, it has.
All right. The next area in your report is the area of forecasting, modelling, horizon scanning, and epidemic intelligence. I don't think, Professor and Doctor, that we'll be assisted by description of the differences between forecasting, modelling, horizon scanning, and epidemic intelligence. But I wanted to ask you about one particular type of epidemic intelligence, which you describe at page 24. Milady, is that a suitable point for a break?
Yes, of course. Sorry, I was...
No, I was slightly taken by surprise.
I shall return at 3:05.